Good afternoon, everyone. Without any further ado, I'd like to just introduce the title of the next session. It's more now going into football, the outlook for global football. And I'd like to invite David Cushnan. He is the head of content at Leaders in Sport, and he has two amazing guests, Michael Mellor, head of football at IMG, and George Pryor, commercial strategy director for AC Milan. David, your floor.
Thank you very much, Vazkan. Hello, everybody from London. Very good to see you, and thanks for joining us for what should be a really fascinating hour ahead, examining the outlook for global football. So much to get into, of course, the fallout from the pandemic, the financial impact on football clubs and leagues, changing power structures, the rise of technology, teams and leagues as media and content producers, and the search for those all-important new revenue streams. So we're going to try and touch on as many of those aspects as possible in the company of our two expert guests who are at the heart of the global game. The way this will work over the next hour is each of our speakers has prepared a short presentation, and after we've heard from them, there'll be time to submit your questions to them. So as Vasco said, coming up shortly, we'll hear from George Pryor, Commercial Strategy Director at AC Milan from Serie A. But we're going to kick off with Michael Mellor, Senior Vice President of Football at IMG Media, responsible for leading the sales and acquisitions of football media rights. And as SVP of football at IMG, Michael has rapidly accelerated IMG's investment in football rights, including the global rights to leagues such as Serie A, Major League Soccer, the Dutch, Australian and Chinese leagues as well, the English and Scottish FA Cups, many more besides. IMG also the long-term commercial partner for CONMEBOL's Copa Libertadores and Copa Sudamerica in South America. It also manages the World Cup qualifiers for 2022 for around 30 federations in the CONCACAF region, and is also, of course, the long-term production and technical partner to the Premier League. So we're in really safe hands for the next 20 minutes or so. Michael, great to have you with us. Very much over to you now.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon to everyone. First of all, I'm going to ask Rob, thank you, to put up my slide presentation. So I've been asked to talk about global trends in football, and as you may appreciate, this could take potentially a whole day or a whole week. There's so much going on in football, but I've tried to narrow it down to what I see as four key areas. Rob, do you want to put up the next slide? So where I see the trends going in football currently is really the greater dominance or the growing dominance of the big clubs. And I mean by the big clubs in Europe, the 16 to 20 clubs like the Barças, the Real Madrids, the Man Uniteds. And I'll talk a little bit about that. The second trend is the growth of private equity investment in the football industry. This has already happened in other sports like Formula One. CVC had a successful investment in Formula One for a number of years, and also is investing in rugby as well right now. But you'll see over the next 3 or 4 years a significant investment coming from private equity into football. Football fatigue has really been a phenomenon which has been with us for a number of years. But I think this is a growing issue in football. Football is no longer a kind of calendar year sort of thing where there'll be breaks in the summer for football players. It's now really very much a 365-day a year sport, where there's obviously big tournaments pretty well held every summer now, not just in the World Cup years or the Euro years. It's actually every year now. And then finally, I'll talk briefly about sort of what I see as a kind of surge in what I'd call non-core revenues in football. That means sort of revenues outside of media and ticketing. And it's an area I'm sure that George Pryor, he'll be following me up and speaking, will also, I'm sure, talk about when it comes to AC Milan. So let me just set the scene for you on football generally. The the sports media rights market in 2020, as you can see on this slide, you can see football really dominates. We're just short of $19 billion in media rights in football. And it's kind of head and shoulders over every other sport. What is interesting, obviously, is the next four sports below that are all US based. American football, basketball, baseball, and US college sports, which basically says a lot about the US media market, which is a huge market for sports rights. And it's interesting to note that American football has just done a deal recently and renewed their rights for another 11 years, and that will jump to 10 billion a year. This is just media rights, I should add. This doesn't include ticketing, sponsorship, and other commercial revenues. If we go to the next slide. And what has been the impact on those media rights from COVID over the last year and a half, effectively? Well, football has come out of it relatively well compared to other sports. As you can see, there's only been a drop of about 10 or 11% in football media rights. Baseball and US college sport have been much more impacted by it. And that's because football really came back probably sooner than any other sport after the pandemic. If you looked at last season, all the major leagues actually managed to finish their season despite the hiatus that the pandemic brought along. And I think that generally it has done well. However, that's not the end of it. The fact is that obviously football is still impacted by a lack of ticketing revenue. Richard Masters came out recently and said he thought that the Premier League clubs alone had lost about £2 billion just from the pandemic. So it's obviously having a major impact. But what I wanted to talk about is really there's an underlying issue with football as a whole. And I hope the next slide, Rob, will show that. So what is happening in football is a concern, I think, for all the clubs, not just the big clubs. But the truth of the matter is that we're seeing football revenues generally have come down. And this is a problem for everyone. It's not just a problem for one or two leagues. Obviously, the big leagues are the ones most impacted, but even the lesser leagues, the Dutch league, the Portuguese league, MLS, etc., are all being impacted by a downturn or a stagnation, I would say, in media rights revenues. So I've given a few examples here. Bundesliga, for instance, their international rights, they've already dropped from 250 million to 200 million in the last cycle. They don't have a deal, for instance, currently in the Middle East. It's a deal that was generated 50 million euros last time round when they were being, but still don't have a deal. Some of you may have read about what's happening in the French league, League One, which I think made a lot of newspapers over the last few months. A deal that was meant to support the French league from Media Pro. It's a 5-year deal worth 1.15 billion, collapsed really at the beginning of this current season. And the revenues now generated for that league is 50% down on what they were anticipating, which, as you can imagine, has a catastrophic effect on the clubs. Serie A, for instance, is now going through a international rights tender. We believe that those rights will drop from about 340 million to what they're generating now to less than 230 million euros. And Premier League, which has kind of been a standard bearer for football rights across the world and has always seen a progress in terms of an upward movement in terms of rights fees, even they are impacted by what's going on in the market. They had a huge deal in China worth $700 million to them over 3 years, and that collapsed at the end of last season. And they're now generating less than $10 million a season for that. And they also saw a downturn in their rights business in domestically last time round, the first real drop in revenue for the Premier League for about 20 years. So as you can see in the bottom here, 8.2 billion euros is what the top 20 clubs had generated for this current season. The problem is it's almost $1 billion less than what they were generating a season before that. So what does that mean for the clubs? If you go to the next slide, Rob, thanks. So basically, the clubs' revenues don't change. In terms of their wage bill, it hasn't changed. They're still paying significant wages to players. Those are going up, they're not going down. So in essence, those big clubs need to find other ways of generating more money. The possibility of doing that from their domestic leagues is problematic because, as I've explained, all those revenues are starting to diminish now. So they need to look elsewhere. And what we're seeing now is how the ECA, which is the European Club Association, is starting to drive the football agenda to ensure that the big clubs in Europe are going to get access to more and more money. And how are they doing that? Because they are looking at things like the European Super League, which is it's a thing that comes around every 4 or 5 years, which is the idea that the clubs would effectively start their own European Super League and not continue with Champions League anymore. I don't think that's going to happen in this next cycle, or perhaps not even in 6 years, but I do think the European Super League is inevitable. What we see instead will be a much expanded Champions League in the next cycle from 2024 onwards. And what will that mean? Will the big clubs will be playing more football? There'll be more matches. There'll be more money from European football for being generated. And the clubs that will participate in this, some of them obviously will do it by merit, and that means finishing the top 4 in the big leagues in Europe. But what the ECA is also proposing, I guess this is possibly the most interesting thing, is that those clubs, some of those clubs will also participate based on their previous performances during the Champions League. So that means that a Juventus or a Man United could finish outside the top 4 or top 5, and they would still participate in European competitions. So a result of this is you're going to see the bigger clubs will obviously grow and generate more money, while the gap between them and the smaller clubs at each league will grow and grow over the years. The growth of private equity, what we're seeing is as the reduction in revenues and the leagues and clubs, there's a shortage of money in the game. And that it means that leagues and clubs are going to have to look elsewhere. There is no shortage of private equity companies keen to jump into football. And we've already starting to see this. Serie A is already flirting with CVC. There's talk about creating a new media company that would manage all of Serie A rights, both domestically and internationally. Bundesliga has now gone out to also seek private equity as well. Silver Lake, a huge US private equity fund, has also bought into the Man City group at 10%. And I think what we're going to see an acceleration of this over the next 2 to 3 years. There are a lot of distressed clubs out there. There are leagues that obviously are looking to build on their revenues over the next 4 or 5 years. And what we'll also see is a multi-club ownership approach. We're going to see private equity not just taking a stake in 1 or 2 clubs, but across all the clubs, not just in football, but obviously in baseball and in basketball and NFL, as we've seen with the Fenway Group, etc. So I see this as a growing trend as private equity see an opportunity to buy its way into the football business. Then football fatigue, as I mentioned earlier, it's not something new. It's something that has been around for a number of years. There's always been concern about player burnout. And I feel that this is an area that's getting increasingly worse. If you look at this table here, this is just an example of some of the tournaments that taking place over the next 4 years. In 21 alone, the Euros have obviously moved now to the summer this year. There's a Copa America also taking place, which obviously is the premium event for the South American nations. There was a Copa America in 2019 as well, and there will be another one in 2024. So what we're seeing now is the frequencies of these competitions are happening more rapidly. There's a Gold Cup this year. Because of the pandemic, World Cup qualifiers are now being condensed and squeezed. So players are being asked to play in more matches. There's an Arab Mundial, which I think maybe many people be aware of, which will be taking place in Qatar at the end of this year in advance of the World Cup. And then there's the Gulf Cup itself, which will take place in December of 21. So as you can see, this year alone, there is a huge amount of tournaments, and that's just the start of it as we move into the World Cup itself, which is obviously the first Winter World Cup. And in theory, that would mean that there would be a bit of a break in the summer of 22 for players. But the issue is that because it's a Winter World Cup, the seasons are going to have to start earlier. So there'll be a relatively short amount of time for players to recoup. And in 23 and 24, just examples of yet again more competitions taking place. And the biggest change will probably be when FIFA obviously announced the dates for their Club World Cup, which is expected to be probably played in 23 as well. And there's talk about that being played not every 4 years, but every 2 years. So again, pressure on players, pressure on clubs to release those players. So what does this mean? And if you go to the next slide, Rob. Well, obviously there's a greater risk of injury. I think that's happening all the time. But also, as there's a greater pull on players, as more national team events take place, as more tournaments are taking place, there's a growing tension between clubs and countries to ensure they get the best players playing in their competitions. And what that means is we're seeing the growth of what I'd call super squads. That means squads which effectively are 24, 26 players, all of a very high quality. Man City is possibly the best example of that. Man City, for instance, is now playing for 4 potential cups this year. They're still in the League Cup final. They've got through the next round of the FA Cup. They're leading the Premiership, as people may be aware. And also, they're on potential route to win the Champions League as well. So that's a huge amount of stress that puts on players playing that amount of games every season. So the only way clubs can cope is obviously to have bigger squads. And it's obviously, if anybody watches the Premier League, it's just as interesting who's sitting on the bench as who's on the playing field. Often you'll see benches worth $200, $300, $400 million of players who are sitting out, but who will obviously need to be rotated over a season to get the best out of them. And that goes back to effectively what I've said from the very start, that the big clubs need more money to obviously to fund those types of squads. And finally, kind of a surge in what I call non-core revenues. These are revenues that you would see not coming from media or ticketing. And I think it's very interesting that in the pandemic, obviously we've seen match day revenues have dropped dramatically, broadcast revenues have come down, but actually the non-core revenues, the commercial revenues actually have started to increase. So clubs have got smarter about how they can generate additional revenues from other parts of their business. What I see is this is a big growth area. I think what we're seeing is an increasing demand for what I'd call non-live content. Fans are keen to see what happens behind the scenes at the big clubs. So we've seen a whole spate of new programs and documentaries coming out, supported by Amazon. Perhaps the most famous is the All or Nothing documentary series, and this will continue over the next few years. Esports is a new big growth area, and that has actually grown significantly. And if we go to the next slide, possibly the 2 areas which I think are possibly the most interesting of where clubs are going with their development and their growth of their non-core revenue is the huge social media followings that clubs are now getting across the world. As you can see, Real Madrid and Barcelona are currently dominating in terms of their social media follows on Twitter. and Facebook. 251 million followers that Real Madrid have, closely followed by Barcelona. And clubs are going to be able to monetize that social media connections over the next few years. And I think this will become a big area of new revenue. And then finally, it would be wrong of me, if you go to the next slide, Rob, not to mention what we call NFTs, or what's also known as non-fungible tokens. So I don't know how many people will know about this, but this is, I guess, probably the biggest and hottest topic being talked about right now across the whole of sport. And I guess the best way to describe this is it's kind of the Bitcoin for the sports business. It basically allows a unique moment to be embodied in a blockchain, which can't be copied, and something that fans are excited about and can bid on and can collect. And as you'll see at the top of this chart, the NBA did this literally in the since the beginning of the year. So this 432% change you'll see is not a year change. This is a change month by month. The fact is the NBA put out these very edited highlights of their season into these collectible cryptocurrency things, which effectively has generated $251 million for them. And that's the NBA alone. They're talking about doing the same now for the UFC, and we haven't even scraped the surface. So personally, I think this is a very interesting area for football, the football business, for football clubs, for football leagues, for FIFA, for UEFA, for instance. I think this could be a huge growth area for the sport in the next 12 to 18 months. Thank you for your time.
And thank you very much, Michael. Absolutely fascinating glimpse into the future, and also a really good overview of what's happening across the football industry. If you've got any questions for Michael, do write them in, and we can ask them of him later on. So we've had the big picture of the trends likely to shape football's future. We thought we'd get a bit more of a club-specific perspective now on some of the challenges and opportunities that have risen out of the pandemic over the past year or so. And for that, we will turn to George Pryor, Commercial Strategy Director at AC Milan, currently sitting in second place in Serie A after a good win yesterday. And George is responsible for implementing an intelligence-led approach to revenue generation across each of Milan's commercial streams as the club looks to return to the pinnacle of European football. Used to work for Chelsea, Formula One, and Manchester United as well. So another very safe pair of hands to guide us through the next 20 minutes or so. So George, will hand the virtual floor over to you.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Michael, for sort of taking us through that. Well, yeah, hello everybody. Just to introduce myself on the back of that, I'm coming from Milan today. It's nice weather here, but again, we're sort of dipping into the red zone. So again, we're always adapting to what is a currently very changeable environment within football. One that's, you know, an exciting environment for everybody and still retains, you know, the interest and adoration of fans around the world. But when you're actually in the industry, now is a time, same with industries all across the world, where we have to make quite significant changes to the ways that we do business. And we have to sort of up our skill sets and professionalize the way that we go to market, the way that we sort of approach the business of sport. And really in general, this means that, you know, as a sport, as an organization, we're just going through a period of unprecedented change. So I just wanted to start by, if everybody can see my screen, I'll take you through a bit of background about AC Milan, first of all. So again, I think everyone will be familiar with the AC Milan on the left-hand side of the screen, which is the AC Milan that won, you know, 7 Champions Leagues, huge number of Serie A titles. But really, the last decade for AC Milan has been a challenging one. There's been a sort of decline in commercial revenues. There's been a decline in on-pitch performance, and a big challenge for us is how we change that going forward. So in 2018, Elliot assumed control of the club, and as a sort of ownership group, have installed a very healthy and very strong management team in place. Ivan Gazidis, Paolo Martini, and Paolo Scaroni, who are really taking a sort of new approach to Milan. So before this pandemic hit, we were looking to take a real sort of change to the way that AC Milan sort of approaches football. That comes across on the pitch in terms of improving the sort of the way that we invest in the squad, shifting the sort of the direction from maybe players that were more high profile, more established, to a younger team. And actually this year, despite having Zlatan Ibrahimovic, we have one of the youngest squads in European football. You know, again, I've spoken about the management team. We've also spent a lot of time on sort of the development of a new stadium as well. So again, I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with this, but we launched a plan last year about the Nuovo Stadio Milano. So a new stadium for Milan, which would completely transform the way that we approach the game, making the game more accessible for fans, and really transforming the way that our matchday revenues would look. Now, obviously, that changes dramatically as a pandemic hits and you move away from, as Michael said, traditional revenue streams, which are matchday and broadcast, and focus much more on commercial, which is where I'll take you through in the rest of this presentation. So again, we've got all of our sort of our core pieces. That means that you then switch to commercial and some other areas around positioning of the club. So making sure that we're relevant in terms of sort of the way that we approach issues like equity and inclusivity. We have a far greater sort of, I guess, we put much greater importance on the women's team. I think that's the best way of putting it. Now we're looking to create equity in the way that we approach our clubs, and we're kind of seeing that with the way that we invest. And so not only is the men's team performing really well within Serie A, but we're also seeing that the women's team have also had a fantastic season and challenging for Europe. And when we get to the position of having kind of this equal level of competition and approach, it means that, you know, we can really start to be talking about a club as a whole and not just a men's football club. And we get away a little bit from the past and we start looking towards the future. So, you know, we're all familiar, and I don't want to sort of spend too long on this, but, you know, a full packed San Siro is an incredible sight to behold. And it's pretty much 12 months since we've seen that now. And again, at the beginning of the crisis, I don't think anyone was expecting well, no one was expecting anything really. Everyone was expecting things to be sort of out by Easter. And, you know, the first we heard about sort of the virus becoming an issue was in the early part of sort of January, February. And then it slowly increased very rapidly to a point where we're moving into lockdown, key revenue streams are shutting down. And so that's kind of led to 3 cycles throughout the whole process. It's kind of, I split them up as sort of react, recover, and rebuild, which again, I think almost every industry will have taken this approach in some way to sort of understand, you know, first and foremost, the health and well-being of employees and in our case, footballers, to make sure that, you know, we're complying with the government regulations. We're making sure that we respect what is, you know, outside of the sport being important, a global situation, which is, you know, affecting everybody around the world. The second thing is what happens when one of your most important revenue streams actually shuts down entirely. So, you know, match day is now gone. For how long, we don't know. And there's a lot of confusion really going down throughout the business from some sort of top to bottom, you know, what's happening, how long is it going to be? And so you start to make sure that, you know, your approach changes throughout this. So you realize the importance of communication, especially as everyone moves to sort of remote working. And so that period is kind of, you know, 2 to 3 months, I would say, whilst everyone was coming to terms with the impact. You're on a commercial side within football, we're managing sort of sponsor expectations, we're managing hospitality and rights holders, we're managing broadcast sort of relationships, as again, giving as much information as we possibly can to ensure that as we come out of this first phase of the pandemic, which everyone is very familiar with, we get into this recovery sort of piece. So again, the final part of Michael's presentation there was really, really spot on, because it speaks about sort of how clubs have had to adapt and how we move. You know, at the beginning of the season, we probably knew that match day is going to be impacted for a while. We don't know when that's coming on. Initially, we thought that might be till January 2021. It's gone on much longer than that. It does mean that sort of other streams that we run and operate, things like soccer schools, things like retail stores, are going to continue to be impacted by social distancing. Some of them have come back in sort of some regard, but we are sort of seeing that, again, with everyone being, well, first of all, being a global club, but everyone being on their own time frame, this doesn't mean that because things are improving in your home market, that things are necessarily improving worldwide. So that's a big piece for us about how do we move to streams that are still bringing in money and still bringing in revenue, and sponsorship is one that's really sort of kept us afloat during this period and seen increased attention. And again, just as we move through to sort of the rebuild phase, it means that, you know, we were already in a digital world, and we were already doing a lot of things to invest in sort of content and key skill sets, but that has really, you know, gone through a period of complete acceleration during these past sort of 12 months. Whereas before, it was sort of, there was a need to invest in social, there was sort of a need to invest and make sure that we're improving our digital platforms. There is a need to make sure that you can communicate with fans and customers, but that takes on a sort of whole new level of importance when it's the only option available to you. So for all the clubs, and stepping away from AC Milan now, for all the clubs and again, rights holders throughout the industry who had started to move down that digital journey or taken the first steps on their sort of roadmap to change what in the sports industry is often, let's say, lagging behind some of the other areas and other industries. If you've moved down sort of to take steps on that journey, you're in a good place, and you've probably accelerated them over the past 12 months. If you hadn't started on that journey, you know, you're probably going to be in a lot more trouble than if you had already, especially looking again outside. And you say with e-commerce, places like Nike, places like Adidas, they're moving very much to a sort of a D2C model that takes advantage of this step and of this change, and you know, clearly see it as a route that certain things are going to go back to normal after the pandemic, and we do hope that we'll be able to get people back in the stadium in the same way that we had before. Some things, certain habits are not going to change. You know, people's media consumption is probably going to increase. People's time on their screens is probably going to increase. People's sort of ways of interacting with entities, with sort of as consumers will probably change. So again, you've got to change, you've got to chase growth, and you've got to diversify the way that you approach this. So again, important that we sort of make sure that going back to the beginning of this pandemic, and I'll just take you through sort of some of the ways that the commercial streams have changed here. But community is always an incredibly important place to start, especially as Milan. We were within Italy, and especially within northern Italy, one of the first places sort of to be hit within Europe, and quite heavily hit as part of the pandemic. So what does that mean? It means that we've got to make sure that for all of our, you know, season ticket holders and are sort of being serviced and looked after. People have sort of, you know, we have areas around the club such as San Siro that, you know, are huge areas where we can actually organize food drops and organize things where we sort of put football to one side, because, you know, for the first 2 months there was no football being played, and the most important thing was using our position to sort of do what we can to bring in a little bit of heightened awareness, to sort of raise the profile of the situation. And again, it meant that it gave us the opportunity to sort of test and learn, and we delivered a sort of an online charity concert, which again, it was something that was moving quite quickly. There was a switch to live stream events. It meant that we could obviously test and learn a new technology, but it also meant that we could raise money for a great cause during the process. So that was the kind of first reaction, is a very sort of human one, which again, it was important that was the way that we led as a club, and important as a reflection of who AC Milan are. So then we sort of, as we came out of the worst period, so the first couple of months where, again, a huge amount of confusion, but it also led to a sort of a huge amount of sort of, not, I wouldn't say a revelation, but an increased impact and focus on how we communicate with a fan base and with a global audience. And you've got to say that you've got to move quickly here. So how much did we increase content versus 18-19 in 2021? It was 71% across all platforms. Now that was, again, a luxury position for us, because we have a Milan media house, so all of our content and production and publishing is done in-house, but it meant that we could dial that up quickly. And it meant that we could dial that up in a way where, when there was no football, that we could be, again, I think we spoke about it a little bit in Michael's presentation, but touched on archive footage, touched on new ways of engaging audience. And again, we experienced kind of a period of rapid growth amongst some of the, the bigger clubs who you probably more often expect to be at the top of a chart on sort of Instagram growth. It meant that we also had to quickly pivot towards innovation. And again, an increased need for content means an increased need for safe spaces to film that content. And again, we'd already taken a few steps on our journey in terms of digitalization. And the studios was a big part of that, having an own space where we can record, we can film, we can produce content. This meant that, again, when we do get to that kind of stage where now we're not gonna retreat in terms of the amount of content that we're producing, but the ways that we're interacting with sponsors means that, again, sponsors are not able to activate and use all of their rights package. That means that content and digital access becomes just a much more heavy and important weight on kind of that side of the sponsorship rights makeup. Then on the right-hand side, again, you can see that we've changed a little bit the match day experience. We've increased the third tier of LED branding, which, again, for those partners who do, see the opportunity that TV provides, and actually, generally sort of digital media and highlights, etc., a much bigger presence on screen when other rights such as hospitality are unable to be delivered during the pandemic. So again, it's a small innovation, but it's one that we were able to take quite quickly. We're able to move on. And it does mean that, when we are looking at partnerships and sponsorship, let's face it, is a huge makeup of that sort of commercial revenue chain outside of the match day. It means that we could look at kind of new ways to deliver for our partners. So that's meant we've had the opportunity to put a lot more of an onus on our women's team and make that sort of a commercially viable stream and an option for our partners. It does mean that sort of we've been able to sort of deliver player access in terms of meet and greets online, getting our players sort of to connect virtually. Again, it doesn't stop you from doing things, but it does change the way that you do things. So it's important that we kind of make that accessibility, we plan ahead further. And again, even with sort of events such as kind of the final round of the NBA, where we're able to kind of work and sort of share some kit and plan ahead for launch day, so that some of the launch for the third shirt with AC Milan actually was launched in a new market, an important market in terms of the US. It just means that you have to plan ahead further, make sure that things that you're doing on the activation side get to the right people at the right time. Important again that I just, on this kind of whistle-stop tour through commercial, just focus a little bit on e-commerce. And I just wanted to share a few figures with you about sort of the way that things have shifted here at Milan. So primarily before the pandemic let's go back to season 18-19, we were 70-30 in terms of bricks and mortar footprint. So physical retail outlets, and with only 30% of our revenue coming from e-com. That's completely transformed in the way that our consumers are sort of engaging with the club and looking to buy product by 2021. And so in the first half of this season, we've seen that number almost invert. And yes, a huge amount of that is down to accessibility, and it may seem like a sort of an obvious point. But for a large portion of the first half of the season, all of our retail revenue outlets were open. So, we weren't really seeing too much of a drop off in terms of bricks and mortar, but we were seeing a change in habits. So more people were comfortable not to go to the store, but to buy online, which meant we can push more in the way that kind of we communicate with our fan base, and the way that we actually make sure that if you're tailoring a relevant customer journey for your fans out there, that means that overall the number doesn't decrease. They just change the way that they're interacting with the club. So again, huge learning for us over this period, and we're adapting going forwards to kind of see. I don't think it'll stay at 70-30, but I do see a sort of split of 60-40 going forwards, where e-commerce will make up the vast majority of our sales. And again, I don't think the trends are sort of too unfamiliar to anyone who's across the sports industry, but we've also taken this opportunity to enter new spaces and connect with new audiences. So whilst this is something that probably would have been on our radar and something that we'd have looked to do, it's again accelerated a trend that we've seen and that we know has happened in the sports industry, and it's something that we've been able to build on. So We founded our own esports team starting this year with AC Milan Clash. Again, it takes a professionalized approach to a new sport. It's a new way of interacting with customers, and it means that, again, we're present in an important and growing market. We've sort of launched a targeted initiative with Fortnite, which again takes us into one of the greatest and most engaged online audiences that is currently available. And it just shows that, you know, when you're sort of engaging with a new audience, such as in Fortnite, or you're moving onto new platforms such as Twitch, it doesn't mean that these are going to become our sort of primary outlets, but it does mean that this period has given us a chance to sort of be present, be part of the conversation, and to learn about the way that we interact with our audiences, so that going forward in an increasingly digitalized world, we will make sure that we're across each of these streams, and that we kind of have a chance to grow along with the esports world and the esports industry. And so just as I bring things to a close, I think it's important to sort of highlight that, you know, if you look at the beginning of this this sort of roadmap here, and we talk about when the pandemic actually hit, so January 2020, you know, we were going live on TikTok, and we launched a partnership with Rock Nation, but pretty much from there onwards, everything that's kind of happened has been during the course of the pandemic. So, you know, renewing our partnership with Emirates, launching a new sponsorship with EA Sports, going live on sort of new platforms such as Twitch, and again, launching an esports organization. It's dramatically probably changed the way that the content and makeup of those commercial highlights look, but ultimately it hasn't changed the way that we've been able to kind of act. And so by pivoting quickly, by moving and being very open to sort of new opportunities and new spaces, it's just given us an opportunity to not slow down our commercial momentum. It's really given us an opportunity to kind of make steps that I think will actually put us in a strong position for the future. And I do think we'll come out of the pandemic a little stronger. So again, just to finish, and I know there's, you know, football, I've looked at this very much through a football lens, but important to say, you know, the things and the themes that have come out of this that are really relevant across all businesses is just sort of taking a pragmatic approach to strategy. So be ready to change course pretty much every 3 months. You know, don't expect that the things that you started at the beginning of your sort of your season, your financial year will continue and maintain all the way through. It won't. But, you know, be optimistic, be positive, and be ready to adapt. And I think as long as you've got that mindset, you can continue to focus on new revenue streams as they come up. You can make sure that you're taking the time to really streamline your costs and have a good hard look at your business and the makeup. You can take this opportunity to kind of invest in talent and technical skill sets. Again, within sports, it's really important that we take this opportunity to professionalize and really come out of this in a different sort of makeup that is probably more digitally focused than we were before. And then finally, you know, increase communication. So making sure that everyone is aware of the strategy and the route that you're taking, and that means both upwards and downwards. So, you know, if you're speaking to senior management, making sure that people are aware of the risks that are upcoming. And again, when you're speaking with the sort of wider teams and across the organization, it's just important that we kind of recognize that this is an unprecedented time. It's a difficult period for everyone. And again, if there's the opportunity, sort of be kind of compassionate and still achieve everything that you want to, I do think that, again, we'll change a lot of approach in the organization and the way that we work. But I do think that coming out of this on the other side, there will be some sort of green shoots, and we might be in a stronger position. So that would be a kind of optimistic message that I leave you with. Thank you very much, and I'll come back to David.
Thank you very much, George. Fascinating stuff. Stay there. We're going to bring Michael back in as well for the next 15 minutes or so for a few questions. If you have any questions, do type them in and they will come to us, and we'll throw them to our experts. Real opportunity to ask a couple of people who are right at the centre of the action in terms of European football in particular. George, just a question for you from me to begin with. Just building on your presentation there, obviously you've got lots of stuff going on, lots of new stuff happening, as you've been forced to do over the past 12 months. And as you said, things have, projects and initiatives have probably accelerated in a way you didn't perhaps quite expect maybe this time last year. How are you monitoring and tracking what fans are making of all these changes and innovations?
Yeah, no, thanks, David. It's a really good question. I think, there's a lot of routes. I mean, the club as a whole has a very much finger on the pulse in terms of the way that the Italian market is reacting. So our fans probably closest to the club are some of the ones that we sort of care most about. And it's been very much a case of understanding and keeping kind of clear communication lines as we go back to those fans who want to interact with the club in terms of coming to the match day, engaging with the club in sort of a physical form and format. But the ways that we're kind of seeing most fans and being a global club and having 95% of our overall fan base outside of Italy, we're really looking at sort of digital and social to sort of provide those metrics back to us. So a lot of sentiment tracking around the things that we do, a lot of focus on the way that certain platforms and streams are growing and others that are kind of slowing down. And really just I guess it's more a case of being up to date, being relevant, over communicating, and then actioning the changes that we see coming back. I mean, we invest and we trust in our teams, and that means that an improved communication performance and improved digital team have actually very much got the finger on the pulse of an awful lot of things. And again, I won't go on too long, but one relevant example quite recently is sort of how would our fans react to sort of Zlatan going back to rejoining the Sweden squad? And that's in a season where, a lot of things have changed for him. He's had a lot of injuries. That means that, we're always on board, but maybe we don't sort of really over communicate that decision on our social streams because it may be something that our fans are more focused on AC Milan. So we give them that approach whereby we take on board the sort of potential fan sentiment and decide how we communicate and adapt accordingly.
Michael, let's bring you back in now, because I'm sure a lot of that will have resonated with you, albeit operating in a slightly different area of the industry. I was really interested in what you were saying about some of the trends that you believe will accelerate into the future, and particularly this idea of multi-club ownership, not only in football, and there's a couple of examples with City Football Group and Red Bull, for example, a couple of others, but team ownership across different sports as well. What do you, as you're seeing the first examples of that really come to life at scale, what are you seeing as some of the pros and cons of that ownership model?
Good question, David. I think one of the key things is best practices and a transfer of knowledge between how things are done in different ways. I think certainly the way clubs are run in the US is different to obviously European football clubs, because obviously you're a different franchise system, etc. But there are things that I'm sure European clubs could learn from the US and vice versa. So a transfer of knowledge, I think, is very useful. Obviously, between football clubs itself, we saw an example of that with the City Group, that Frank Lampard, as you know, spent some of the twilight of his career at Man City and then moved from there to New York City. So the transfer of players between clubs, and obviously City also own a club in Australia, for instance. So you could see that being used potentially as a feeder club to other clubs around the world where they own. So that's probably another opportunity for them as well. But I mean, we all know that when it comes to the big clubs in Europe, they are going to be limited. There's only, I'm not sure, I think it's about a 10% ownership that you're allowed when it comes to the big clubs. You can't have multi-club ownership. I know only couldn't own Leeds and Man United, as we know, because of the potential conflict of interest there. But I do see it between different continents and different regions of the world. I think it's kind of what I see is a kind of also economies of scale. Why wouldn't you have a number of clubs where you can obviously you can do things that could mean savings in costs across the globe.
There's been it's often talked about that there's a player development aspect to that kind of thing, but perhaps the business elements is something that has been a little bit underplayed. Interested, just to build on that, Michael, in terms of looking a little bit beyond Europe, and we have a question from the audience about this in a moment, but which football markets are you watching carefully, whether they're big, small or medium markets at the moment, where are you seeing some potential for commercial growth?
I mean, and I wouldn't describe it, as a football market, but the US, I think George would agree, because I'm sure a lot of the fan base he's getting is coming from the US. US market is, in my opinion, is a really very interesting and booming market right now for football. And ESPN with their OTT platform has kind of kickstart the start of that market, but now you've got CBS coming in, NBC launching their own OTT platforms, the Spanish networks, Telemundo and Univision. I think this is a really, really interesting market for football rights generally. The Premier League, who currently got a 6-year deal with NBC, is going to come to an end. Well, I think they'll come out probably in the next 4 to 5 months into that market, and I think that's going to be hugely competitive. And they're getting about 200 million a season at the moment. I could see that going up significantly in that market with the competition there is. I think that's a big area. The one other area I think is people look to Asia, clubs look to Asia, and they look to China mainly. But I think the rest of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Vietnam, I would say Myanmar, except obviously for the political issues there right now, those are all prime markets which I think will develop. I think obviously that's maybe 4, 5, 6 years away, but certainly Indonesia as a market, I could see that could boom in 5 or 6 years' time.
George, I'm sure you would want to add to that. You've got a US owner now in place at Milan, and I presume the United States is one of the areas of your world map that you're sticking pins in when you're plotting your international strategy.
Absolutely. I think again, Michael raises a really good point. It's a really mature and developed sports market. And I think, we see that maybe actually the first interaction that people may have with AC Milan and sort of on a football side in the US might be through FIFA and through sort of the sort of esports route. And if that is the case, by doing a partnership with EA Sports, what does that give us? It gives us a greater opportunity to market and grow that audience, so that when they do sort of develop and switch over to sort of broader consumers of the club, it means that we're known, it means that we're recognized. So again, US is important, a huge piece for that. And I would just say to Michael's point, the markets in Southeast Asia are markets for us to nurture and grow. They're not markets that are going to return sort of huge sums back to the club, broadcast aside, in this very short term. But there are opportunities, again, where we have, an opportunity to grow on social, an opportunity to engage, and an opportunity just to bring people closer to the club over time, so that when we do reach that point where a proper interaction or greater interaction can be held, that we're ready to act.
Michael, question from the audience for you about the Qatar Stars League in particular, and about the sort of commercial pathway that you see forward for that. And when will agencies start looking at that league, and I suppose other similarly sized emergent leagues in a bit more depth?
Interesting question. I mean, I don't know if people are aware, but actually IMG consulted and helping build the Qatar league. I guess the question is, how can it develop commercially outside of Qatar? I think that's undoubtedly a challenge, but it's not to say that couldn't happen over a period of time. I see the opportunity there is where something like the Arab Gulf Federation is coming in. I think the opportunity with a league like that is to go through the growth in things like the Gulf Cup, and also things, there is plans obviously to kind of create a club version of the Gulf Cup on an annual basis, where you're going to have the winners of the top leagues playing each other. I think that's interesting. I think that starts to become interesting on a wider scale. And obviously, it's like a lot of leagues where you start to bring in overseas players. MLS has done that quite successfully over the years. They seem to have done it less, but if you can bring in stars, China's done it, India's done it, that maybe the Qatar League should think about what big name players they could attract to that league over the next few years, because I think that will obviously propel it in terms of visibility across the world.
The regional or continental Super League model is one that you talked about, and you know, with regards to Europe, obviously there's been some movement there, and a continuing edging towards one day perhaps that being the case. That's obviously a US closed model with potentially little room for promotion and relegation as we've come to know it. There's also, I think, conversations in Africa around a Super League development there, perhaps with different objectives in terms of raising the level. Is that where we're heading, do you think, in terms of football on a global basis? And is it likely to happen, do you think, in terms of a big step revolution, or as we're seeing in Europe, very, very incremental steps over decades?
The truth is, I think everybody prefer is to have open leagues where there's relegation and promotion. I think that's definitely how FIFA would like to see it as well. Obviously, in the US, the closed league's been done because that was considered to be the most sustainable model to create, commercially, for basically big owners to come in and put money into MLS teams initially. I think that there's obviously pressure on MLS now, for instance, to create a situation of maybe having more than one league and having relegation promotion. I'm sure the owners will hate it. Then if you look to Europe, yeah, I mean, if a European Super League is going to be created, the reason behind that, as we know, is because commercially the clubs feel that's the best opportunity to generate the most money for their clubs. Because at the moment in the current situation with domestic leagues, they certainly the Premier League, they tend to take a fairly equal share of media revenues. And I can actually I sort of can hear where the clubs are coming from, because they say, well, there's 4 or 5 clubs in any major league who probably generate 70 or 80%. I think AC Milan, Inter Milan, Juventus, Roma are the top 4 clubs in Serie A, and understandably think they should be getting a bigger share of the pie because they do generate the most interest in commercial revenue. And therefore, if they're not getting it, what's the next step for them? And the European Super League seems inevitable, in the sense that's the best way that they're going to generate the most money. And obviously, once they're in there, and there'll be a founding partnership, I'm sure, which will probably have the top 16 clubs. And I think it will probably mean it will be a closed league for a period of maybe 4 or 5 years initially, but then there may be open up to hopefully more clubs being allowed in. It's hard to know how this is going to go, because obviously, it seems inevitable, but then anything that brings in a European Super League ultimately will be detrimental to the domestic leagues, as we know, and I think that's the challenge that people are facing.
George, let's bring you in for a final word. We're just nearly out of time here, but obviously as those structural changes bubble away at the top of the European game, and AC Milan obviously will be involved in those to some extent. There's obviously the short and possibly sort of medium-term revenue challenges, and you talked about retail and content creation, as well as esports and gaming. How do you expect all that to evolve in the medium term for AC Milan and also sort of similarly sized clubs across Europe?
Yeah, no, I think all clubs will now be having a lot of a harder look at retail. It's kind of a channel that's been neglected by a lot of clubs, whilst sort of sponsorship and match day dominate. So I do think that there will be a little bit of a shift in that respect, and taking a greater and more professionalized sort of focus on that bit. That means catching up with wider global businesses and people from outside the sports industry. So look outside, look to America. Just to kind of finish up in terms of content, again, I think, Michael's very astute in pointing out the NFTs. I think that'll be a really sort of short-term period of growth for clubs. I don't know whether that's going to turn into a long-term and sustainable revenue stream, but it does mean that when you get these opportunities, when you have a chance to pivot, and when you have a chance to move very quickly, you've just got to take advantage of it and go along for the ride.
George, Michael, it was an ambitious effort to try and cover the whole of the future of football in an hour, but I think we gave it our best shot. So really appreciate your time, Michael Mellor, SVP of Football at IMG Media, George Pryor, Head of Commercial Strategy at AC Milan, and from me, David Cushnan from Leaders. Thanks for being with us.